You're now watching Around the Horne, the weekly internationalist news update with author and historian Gerald Horne.
Today is May 14th, 2025. Welcome everyone to the weekly series entitled Around the Horne, which is an internationalist news update with historian and Professor Gerald Horne. Dr. Horne's latest book, which was just released and is now available for pre-order on the International Publisher's website, and is entitled The Capital of Slavery, Washington, D.C., from 1800 to 1865. Dr. Horne is also a permanent guest on the radio show, The Horne Report, which airs on Black Power 96 Radio on Sundays at 3:30 p.m. Eastern Time, and Dr. Horne also hosts a radio show entitled Freedom Now, which airs on KPFK 90.7 FM in Los Angeles on Saturdays at 11 a.m. Pacific, and replays of both shows can be found on the Activist News Network. Horne, as we go around the horn. First, we want to ask you about the news from this past Sunday, May 11th, that a group of 49 Afrikaners, white settler-descended South Africans, boarded a flight to the U.S., and upon arrival, they were granted refugee status by the Trump administration, which has fast-tracked Afrikaner refugee applications, even as it has shut down refugee applications from everywhere else, including Haitians, Cubans, Venezuelans, and Afghanis. Dr. Horne, what is your reaction to the Trump-Musk administration's approach to Afrikaners, members of what is still easily the most economically privileged demographic in South Africa, as worthy of refugee status?
Perhaps the most economically privileged demographic in the entire African continent. Of all the misdeeds and crimes that the Trump regime has perpetrated over these past 100 days or so, including sending Abrego Garcia, a resident of Maryland, to a hellhole of a prison in El Salvador, and Mr. Trump promising and pledging to send so-called homegrowns, that is to say, people like myself and perhaps those in our audience, to a similar fate. And of course, Libya and Rwanda are also being prepared as possible landing spots for perhaps homegrowns and certainly undocumented workers. But I think that in some ways, what has just happened with regard to U.S.-South Africa relations is one of the most outrageous episodes in a litany of outrages perpetrated by the Trump regime. It's not only, as has been suggested, that thousands of Haitians are in the process of being stripped of temporary protective status, which means they'll be sent back to their homeland in the Caribbean. It's also that this episode was based upon a misunderstanding, or perhaps an intentional misunderstanding, because there is no genocide being inflicted upon this European minority in South Africa. There are no special laws meant to deprive them of their human rights. What Elon Musk, First Buddy, and Mr. Trump are pointing to is the fact that the African National Congress government in Pretoria has authorized legislation not dissimilar from legislation in the United States of America that goes under the heading, the power of eminent domain. In the United States, the power of eminent domain, as many could inform, allows the government to seize property with compensation if they want to build a highway, for example, or some other public purpose. In any case, the law that has been authorized in South Africa serves to try to rebalance the economic situation, which has tended to privilege these European minorities ever since they invaded South Africa in 1652. Now, what's even more striking is that I'm not sure if our friends on the left can take advantage of this gift that has been handed to them by Mr. Trump, because in order to do so, they would have to acknowledge the fact that what is taking place, or what has taken place just this week, is another episode in a long, disgusting history of settler solidarity. That is to say, if one looks at the support for genocide and historic Palestine, that too is a display of settler solidarity. When South Africa's neighbor, speaking of Zimbabwe, embarked upon land reform some years ago, perhaps in the last decade or so, under the ZANU-PF government, taking land, oftentimes unused land, likewise in South Africa, from the European minorities, some of whom had only arrived in Zimbabwe in 1945 or thereafter. The economy was driven into the ditch. It's still being driven into the ditch because stiff sanctions were slapped upon the regime, and the regime is having difficulty recovering from same. So because of the failure to acknowledge settler colonialism, which means that one does not acknowledge settler solidarity, it also suggests and also means that our friends on the left oftentimes don't understand or comprehend or acknowledge apartheid solidarity. In fact, they are reduced objectively to mimicking, I'm afraid to say, the worst instincts of Barack Obama and Joseph Biden. Recall that whenever some episode like this takes place that casts a harsh light upon the misdeeds of U.S. imperialism, these two men are quick to say that's not who we are. Well, objectively, that's what some of our friends on the left are saying. That's not who we are, when in fact, this is who we are. After all, as I said in my book, The Counter-Revolution of 1776, when the United States was authorized some 250 odd years ago, it was basically the first apartheid state. And therefore, you can draw a straight line from July 4th, 1776 to May 2025, when these so-called refugees landed in Dulles Airport outside of Washington, D.C. in Virginia, and were driven in a motorcade befitting eminent personalities to their new homes, where, by the way, they will be feted and treated by dint of our taxpayers' dollars. Yes, you and myself, that is to say, those of us who pay taxes to Uncle Sam, are basically subsidizing these so-called refugees, who, of course, not coincidentally enough, inevitably will be added to the voting rolls and therefore will be supporting the right wing, the Trumpistas in the United States of America. This lack of understanding of the history of the United States of America is really spinning out of control. But fortunately, I have some good news from Canada. In light of the fact that Mr. Trump has outraged Canadians by threatening to annex this gigantic country, increasingly, even in the corporate media, there have been articles upbraiding and dissecting the history of the United States of America. I'll refer you to an article in the Toronto Globe and Mail, the leading newspaper in this vast country, just this past Monday, where an op-ed writer pointed out that one of the reasons why there was a revolt against British rule in 1776 is that London had passed the so-called Quebec Act, which basically sought to make amends to the French-speaking population of Quebec and accord them human rights and civil rights to a degree. And many of the so-called rebels and patriots, led by Benjamin Franklin, whose portrait can now be found on the $100 bill, these Protestant maniacs objected to extending human rights to Catholics, which of course casts severe doubt upon the fact that many of our friends on the left see the United States of America establishing some certain bourgeois democratic rights, like the right to religion. And of course, in my book that was kindly mentioned in the introduction, The Capital of Slavery, I point out the rather strong and odious anti-Jewish fervor that animated the founding fathers from the inception of the Republic. So even in the midst of this latest outrage, the landing in Washington, D.C. of these fake refugees, there still remains good news, I'm happy to say.
Mr. Horne, as we go around the horn, we also want to ask you about the U.S. trade war against China. Over the weekend, the United States and China announced a 90-day pause on most of their recent tariffs after negotiations in Switzerland. The combined U.S. tariff rate on Chinese imports will be cut to 30% from 145%, while China's levies on U.S. imports will fall to 10% from 125%. Dr. Horne, what is your analysis of this news that the U.S. and China agree to slash tariffs for 90 days?
Well, the good news is, number one, that Mr. Trump blinked. That is to say, he was eyeball to eyeball with President Xi Jinping, and Mr. Trump blinked. That is to say, he inaugurated unilaterally this so-called trade war on April 2nd, 2025, alleged Liberation Day. And those nations who did not go along with these newly installed tariffs were promised that they would be penalized stiffly. China did not go along, leading to this 145% increase in tariffs, which amounts to a kind of trade embargo. But it turns out that the United States has not been able to endure this short-term pain since April 2nd, 2025. I mean, keep in mind, as we reported in past weeks, already you see that UPS, United Parcel Service, whose leader, Teamster leader, Sean O'Brien, bent the knee at the GOP convention in the summer of 2024. His union, which delivers packages, has been forced to absorb 20,000 layoffs. You've had reports coming from the Seattle-Tacoma port that it was becoming a ghost town. All of this is due to the fact that these workers have been heavily dependent upon trade across the Pacific with the People's Republic of China. There still might emerge empty shelves in basic retail stores, and Mr. Trump was reduced to the absurdity of suggesting that children who perhaps had 30 dolls can get along easily, he says, with 2 dolls. And the mob boss in the White House was instantly dubbed Donnie Two Dolls by some with a certain sense of humor. So already we begin to see that inflation is creeping up. In fact, that bugaboo of a capitalist economy, so-called stagflation, that is to say stagnation plus inflation, is already bedeviling the U.S. economy. But in the larger scheme of things, I think that just as April 2nd was quite illustrative and revealing, insofar as it was a desperate gamble by Mr. Trump to try to raise revenues from the rest of the nations in the world so that he could execute tax cuts for his billionaire buddies. And therefore, he did not embark on a strategy that would involve uniting the European Union and other capitalist countries with the United States and then going after China. He went after the capitalist allies as well, which was a major strategic blunder. But at the same time, it reveals the weaknesses of U.S. imperialism, and the weaknesses were validated even more on May 11th, May 12th, 2025, when Mr. Trump and his negotiating team, led by Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent and Trade Representative Jamieson Greer, were forced to walk back their aggressiveness with regard to China. And at the end of the day, this suggests that China has leverage that it can now exercise quite adroitly against U.S. imperialism. And you saw evidence of that this past Friday on Victory Day in Moscow, where President Xi Jinping stood shoulder to shoulder with President Putin of Russia, and they were all joined by President Lula of Brazil, who, by the way, is now in China, not to mention President Diaz-Canel of Cuba, President Mnangagwa of Zimbabwe, President Maduro of Venezuela, and a number of other leaders. And so, as we have been stressing, this represents a fundamental shift in the global correlation of forces, which suggests that progressive and radical forces in the United States of America should seize this opportunity to press an aggressive offensive.
Horne, as we go around the horn, we also want to talk to you about the reports from this past Sunday, May 11th, about President Trump's deal with the royal family of Qatar to accept a $400 million jumbo luxury jet. Many experts have stated that this is possibly the most valuable such gift a foreign government has ever given a president of the U.S. What we know about the plan is that the Boeing 747, known as the Flying Palace, would be retrofitted for use as Air Force One, then donated to Trump's presidential library at the end of his term in order to allow him continued use of the jet even after he leaves office. Dr. Horne, what is your analysis of this? Is the $400 million Flying Palace given to Trump by the Qatari a gift, or another glaring example of grift on the part of Trump? And what else should our audience know about President Trump's trip to West Asia?
Well, obviously, is the mother of all grifts, if I can coin a phrase. It's unclear, number one, if the U.S. authorities will be able to retrofit this jet, because it is widely suspected that the Qataris might place electronic surveillance on this plane that would make them privy to otherwise private communications that take place on this new version of Air Force One. Not to mention the fact if the U.S. authorities will be able to retrofit the plane to make it into a kind of flying battle station equipped with, for example, offensive and defensive weapons. In any case, I think we should spend a moment or two talking about this trip to the Persian Gulf and to Saudi Arabia, because it's quite illustrative. Number one, many headlines are claiming that this trip represents a snub to Israel, insofar as Mr. Trump is not landing in the Zionist entity, not to mention the fact that before this trip, Mr. Trump backed out of his offensive against the Yemenis, who have been shooting missiles into Israel, not to mention the fact that in retrospect, we can see that when he invited Mr. Netanyahu to the Oval Office, and then while he was there, announced that there would be negotiations with the Iranians, retrospectively, that could be seen also as a slap at Israel, which wants to bomb Iran sooner rather than later. And the fact that he is getting ever more cozy with Mohammed bin Salman, the de facto leader of Saudi Arabia, is not necessarily good news for Israel, in light of the fact that the Saudis are unwilling, apparently, to improve relations with Israel unless and until there is a Palestinian state. But this meeting today, May 14th, with the de facto leader of Syria, speaking of the man once known as al-Jilani, now as al-Shara, is quite illustrative. Recall that this is a chap who has had very curious ties to religious zealotry, including the Islamic State, including al-Qaeda, for example. This is a man who has in his ranks, and this is the real tell, religious zealots from the outskirts of Russia, from the outskirts of Western China. And that is a calling card, or that is a plus as far as U.S. imperialism is concerned. But it also sheds a harsh light on the U.S. left. Recall that in the run-up to the overthrow of the preceding al-Assad regime in Damascus, the U.S. left, at least portions of it at least, were some of the harshest critics of al-Assad. And to perhaps make a naive statement, perhaps they were not aware that waiting in the wings was refurbished al-Qaeda to take the place of Mr. al-Assad. And I should have mentioned in that previous litany with regard to having in his ranks staunch opponents of Russia and China, that the al-Shara coalition also includes some of the more diabolical elements who are opposed to the Islamic Republic in Iran, which is something that moves us ever closer, I'm afraid to say, to some sort of murderous confrontation with the Islamic Republic. But I think also that those who have an interest and African progress should look at this trip of Mr. Trump with a jaundiced eye, because another stop in this jaunt, in this tour, will be at the offices, at the headquarters of the United Arab Emirates, which, as you know, has been a major supporter and funder of religious zealotry throughout Africa, not least in the Sahel states, speaking of Niger, Burkina Faso, Mali. Ibrahim Traore, the leader of Burkina Faso, has gotten understandable and justifiable publicity of late, including showing up on Victory Day in Moscow, May 9th, 2025. And these religious zealots are bedeviling the Sahel states, and I'm afraid to say, forcing them into uncomfortable compromises. With regard to the latter, I'm speaking of the fact that in order to gain an outlet to the sea, these three landlocked countries have just cut a deal with Morocco. Morocco in North Africa, one of the few states that have joined the so-called Abraham Accords, which involves warming relations with Israel. But that's not the worst aspect of this deal that the Sahel states have been forced into with Morocco. The other troublesome aspects is that perhaps they will be forced to turn a blind eye to the fact that Morocco continues to have a death grip on Western Sahara, a former Spanish colony that Spain evacuated in 1975. We know that the sole legitimate representative of the people of Western Sahara is the Liberation Movement Polisario, which is backed by Algeria, which in turn is being harassed by the former colonial master, that is France. And it is possible that the Sahel states somehow will get caught up in this controversy involving Western Sahara, Algeria, Morocco, and France that they really need to avoid. And so when you study the press reports about Mr. Trump's visit to the United Arab Emirates in particular, which I take it will unfold tomorrow, pay close and careful attention to whatever communique emerges from this huddle, because whatever it may say, I can guarantee you it portends bad news for the Sahel states.
Dr. Horne, as we go around the horn, we also want to ask you about the China-CELAC Forum that opened yesterday, May 13th. CELAC, of course, referring to the bloc of Latin American and Caribbean states, consisting of 33 countries, and is seen as an alternative to the Organization of American States, the OAS. The fourth ministerial meeting of the China-CELAC Forum, under the rotating presidency of Colombia, is being held in Beijing. Dr. Horne, how is the China-CELAC Forum an important instrument to understand the extension, depth, and maturity of the relationship between China and Latin America and the Caribbean in the 21st century?
Well, this summit represents a continuing overthrow and undermining of the moth-eaten Monroe Doctrine enunciated by Washington 2 centuries ago, which suggested that no other powers beside the United States of America should be involved in the internal affairs in this hemisphere. CELAC, fortunately, excludes the United States of America. It also excludes Canada, too, by the way. And if the Canadians were wise, speaking of Prime Minister Mark Carney, they would try to build a bridge to Brazil, to Cuba, and to the CELAC nations, because obviously they are in the crosshairs, just like Cuba is in the crosshairs. Interestingly enough, despite the fact that Argentina has been put forward as some sort of Trump alternative in the Americas, Argentina still has very positive relations with China. In fact, Argentina is seeking to steal, if I may use that verb, certain markets heretofore dominated by the United States. I'm speaking of the export of beef from Argentina to China, which the United States had a very important hold on until this so-called trade war. I'm also happy to report that the Colombians under President Petro are deciding to join the Belt and Road Initiative. This is this major infrastructural development coming out of China, which has had monumental impact already in Africa. now, of course, is beginning to have the same impact in South America. And in some ways, Colombia is replacing its former province. Speaking of Panama, which had its arm twisted and therefore backed out of the Belt and Road Initiative. Recall this was part of the controversy a few months ago involving the United States seeking to claim or to annex or steal, if you like, the Panama Canal. But perhaps the biggest news out of this meeting, this summit in China, is that prominent in his presence was President Lula. This was a ministerial meeting, basically at the level of foreign ministers. And the fact that a head of state, speaking of President Lula, decided to show up signifies the fact that Brazil sees relations with China as being essential to its trajectory in the 21st century. And so once again, we see that China is making great strides. But I must make a footnote here, which is that I'm still puzzled by the fact that when there are analysts, even on the left, who seek to analyze the rise of China, understandably, they point to the role of the hardworking Chinese working class. Understandably, they point to the role of capital infusions from the Chinese diaspora in Southeast Asia, particularly in Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, Philippines. But few, if any, put it in the context of the United States creating favorable conditions for the rise of China with this Nixon-Kissinger deal of a half century ago on an anti-Soviet basis, which led to massive direct foreign investment from the United States and its allies into the People's Republic of China. Why that latter fact is neglected is rather curious, although I think it has something to do with the fact that there are those in the United States who still consider the collapse of the Soviet Union to be a very signal victory. And of course it was for US imperialism. And they feel, I take it, that if you connect the collapse of the Soviet Union to the rise of China, well, then obviously that victory, so-called, tends to shrink in profundity and importance.
Horne, as we go around the horn, we also want to ask you about the statement that U.S. President Donald Trump made this past Monday, May 12th, that the European Union is worse than China. Just hours after Washington and Beijing agreed to slash respective punitive tariffs and de-escalate their trade war, President Trump said, quote, the European Union is in many ways nastier than China. Trump went on to say, quote, oh, they'll come down a lot. You watch. We have all the cards. They treat us very unfairly. Dr. Horne, what is your reaction to these statements by President Trump?
Well, it's nothing new. You recall that John Bolton, his former national security advisor, in his memoir, repeatedly says that Trump denounced the European Union, which is, once again, rather curious, because if he's serious about confronting the People's Republic of China, you would think that he would want the European Union on side. But instead, he's denouncing the European Union. He's slapping tariffs on the European Union. The EU is poised to respond with reciprocal tariffs against Kentucky bourbon, against Harley Davidson motorcycles, against the so-called Magnificent Seven out of Silicon Valley, including Facebook, and out of Seattle, including Amazon, for example. So the strategy of Mr. Trump with regard to pursuing China, one would think would involve enlisting the European Union, but instead he's denouncing the European Union. And I should mention in this context that it's more serious perhaps than just a parlor argument about geopolitical strategy. Because as we reported on this program some weeks ago, French nuclear submarines have been spotted off the coast of Halifax, Nova Scotia, within spitting distance of Boston. Recall that Prime Minister Mark Carney, his first foreign trip after assuming that lofty office was to France. Then, secondly, to London. The erstwhile head of state, King Charles III, resides there, as you know. And I think that the Republican strategists who are advising Mr. Trump need to be reminded that other countries have cards to play, not only in terms of French nuclear submarines, but where I'm sitting here in Victoria, British Columbia, the 19th century, you had U.S. strategists saying that Victoria, British Columbia was the equivalent of Havana, Cuba, just like Victoria challenges potentially Seattle and Havana challenges potentially Miami. But I'm afraid we've reached the end of the road.
We state these facts only to let you know that those of us who are revolutionary, Pan-Africanists, is not because we love revolution. It is historically determined, and we have no alternative but to follow history and to use history for the benefit of our people.
Power to the people.